My parents' home is on the outskirts of town in the country. The land is a couple of acres in size, and the home is also rather spacious. My room is on the other side of the house and has its screened-in porch, which I used to share with my sister while she was still living at home, but it's now just me. The screen door has no lock, and I normally leave my porch door open in the colder months for circulation. When my city or suburban friends came over, they would get on my case about it, telling me how dangerous it was for a female to sleep in a room that wasn't entirely closed off from the outside world. I always dismissed it since I live so far in the woods that it's almost unheard of for someone to just stroll into someone else's land. Furthermore, my parents' property is fenced, so no one could drive a vehicle up to the home. However, I began to notice that objects were being changed on the porch while I wasn't using it. It was simple things like the beanbag being relocated slightly to the opposite side, or one of the drawers being cracked open. I honestly didn't give it much thought. Despite my concerns, I generally utilized the porch to smoke and keep the scent out of the home, so I assumed I was smoking too much and forgetting some of the things I was doing, which was certainly plausible. That, and my parents, particularly my mother, would sometimes come over and adjust things without notifying me. I assumed this had to be the case, so I respectfully asked my mother whether she had lately been on my porch and moved anything. But she maintained she hadn't, that she hadn't been on my porch or in my room in over a week. This was at first alarming to me, but then I realized that my mother, like me, often forgets half of what she does. I also suspected she was lying because she had discovered an ashtray or something and didn't want to address what I was doing out there. I still asked my father, just to be sure, but he laughed it off, claiming there was no way in the world he'd want to look through his teenage daughter's things. With an unresolved inquiry, but a little brevity to balance it out, I thought it wasn't worth worrying over. My parents informed me a few days later that they were leaving town for the weekend. They both work in the same sector, and there's a huge sales conference in the next state, but they'd stay in a hotel for a couple of nights and return on Sunday. They gave me full reign of the home and said I could have friends over as long as everything was cleaned up and nothing was destroyed. Of course, as soon as they left, I held a party and wrecked the home, promising myself that I'd clean everything up in the morning. But that night, when everyone had gone home, I couldn't sleep. I'm not sure whether it was concern about cleaning up the following day or intuition, but I was up in bed for nearly 2 hours and couldn't sleep. At this point, I believed I could force myself to pass out if I walked out to the porch and smoked several bowls. I took my bong from its hiding place and filled it with water. Then I stepped out on the porch, but I paused as I came to the threshold. I couldn't even see anything, but I immediately knew something wasn't right. As I concentrated on the arrangement of objects on the porch, a shudder raced down my spine. The beanbag had shifted a few inches, but more importantly, it seemed to have a mound of blankets on it that hadn't been there a few hours before. When I got a closer look, I saw there was a human sleeping on it, which terrified me. I gasped loudly enough to alert the individual to my presence, and their eyes opened at that instant. In the dim light, I saw the whites of their eyes staring at me. I yelled and threw down my bong, destroying it. Then I slammed and closed the porch door. I was terrified for a few seconds and couldn't move. So I saw this individual get up and run off the porch via the screen door through the blinds. I raced to lock every entry to my bedroom as soon as they were out of sight, and then I contacted the police. They arrived over an hour later, but the individual had already left, and all the officers did was stare at me as if I were crazy or insane. They simply pretended to accept my statement, then departed without following up. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep at this point, so I remained up in the living room with all the lights on until the sun came up. After I had cleaned up all of the messes around the home, I contacted my parents and informed them what had occurred. Since then, I've put a padlock on the inside of my screen door to keep burglars away while maintaining ventilation in my chamber. Thankfully, I'm sure the person was simply homeless and seeking a place to sleep, but it still freaks me out that they were sleeping less than 20 feet away from me for who knows how many nights before I saw them. Things may have been considerably worse if they had been a worse person or had been more inclined to do something bad over time. On the surface, my father was a very traditional boomer. He had a lousy marriage with my mother and enjoyed hiding out in his basement man cave. During football season, he'd invite his friends over to drink beer and shout at the large flat-screen TV on the wall. Aside from that, he worked from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and often remained late and departed early for work, either to get more done or to spend more time away from home. I hardly ever saw him throughout the week. When we went home, I'd get hooked into my schoolwork or video games, while he'd get sucked into his television, whether it was on cable or one of his antique videos and DVDs. On weekends, he and his friends would spend time together bonding. We began watching movies from his collection when I was a teenager. I appreciated the new custom, but I was old enough to see that something was odd with the setting from the start. My father kept all of the DVDs on the shelf next to the TV. The recordings, on the other hand, were a different story. In the male cave, there was a little closet door that I was specifically told not to open. It kept some of my father's most valued and intimate treasures, which he may let me view one day when I was older. All I knew was that there were a ton of video home system cassettes inside. My father would generally ask me to explain the kind of movie I wanted to watch, such as who was in it or if it was a Western or anything. He'd always respond, "Oh sure, I've got the perfect movie for you, kid," after asking me a few questions. But more often than not, he'd enter his storage room, disappear for a few minutes, and then return with an R-rated cult classic VHS film from the 1980s or 1990s. My father never held back when it came to the substance of the movies he showed me, and naturally, my mother was never there for these movie evenings. Whenever she had to put her head in to say anything to me or my father, she always had a strange expression on her face that I could never explain. Despite her obvious pain, I became addicted to this ritual with my father. My curiosity about what was beyond the door developed throughout the months and years. My main opinion was that he had a true stockpile of collectibles gathered in there, similar to a large investment that he was simply sitting on while the value was built, waiting for the opportune time to sell it off. But I was always too afraid to look in, and with my father spending practically all of his spare time down there, I didn't have many opportunities to sneak in. Then one day, my chance presented itself. My parents' old friend Victoria died suddenly, and they needed to attend her burial, which meant they would be gone for the larger part of the day. They let me remain at home since I had never seen Victoria before, and I realized immediately that this was my opportunity. I'd finally be alone at home long enough to glance inside. I waited over an hour for them to go to ensure they didn't return for whatever reason. I snuck down the basement, my pulse hammering as I moved up to the door, and, at long last, entered the hidden chamber. I was quite aback by how large it was. I'd envisioned a little linen closet, but it was really large enough to hold a king mattress if you could only get it through the door. I yanked the cord on the incandescent light bulb hanging from the ceiling, illuminating the highly classified ca. I was first really dissatisfied. I only noticed a few shelves of high school and college souvenirs, a few trinkets, a record collection, and some vintage cameras, even an unplugged chest freezer with several boxes of VHS cassettes piled on top. However, I felt that if there was anything nice, I'd have to dig for it, so I took the VHS cartons out of the freezer and opened them. Despite growing up with free internet access, my stomach turned upside down when I saw what was heaped up in the chest. There was a plethora of Playboy publications. I giggled at the prospect of my father being so similar to me as a young man. Then I began to rummage through the Playboys for a bit. I was looking for the genuine vintage issues, the very ancient ones, which I assumed would be near the bottom. So I dumped them all on the floor to see what was below. That's when I discovered the true discovery, one I wish I hadn't made. There were 4 ammunition boxes neatly stacked at the bottom, each labeled Miscellaneous, Memories with Anthony, and Memories with Bob and Melissa were among the options. Memories with Victoria, the final one said. A million thoughts raced through my mind by then. the most pressing of which was why these memories had to be preserved so secretively, and what kind of family friend was Victoria that her memories had to be kept under lock and key. Torn between remaining uninformed and fulfilling my curiosity, I ultimately decided I wanted to know who Victoria was and why my parents needed to attend her funeral, even though I had never met her. When I opened the ammunition box, I saw it was filled with VHS tapes, all of which were labeled with dates and nothing else. I chose one at random from at least 20 years ago and brought it out to the den to watch on the VCR. I felt humiliated within seconds, but I couldn't bring myself to eject the video right then and there. I saw a dimly lighted bedroom on the television. I saw my mom from 20 years ago, nude and tied up, totally immobilized and gagged, on a chair in the corner. She was sobbing on the bed. I saw my father and an unknown lady, likely Victoria, kissing my father in front of my mother. Tears welled up in my eyes and streamed down my cheeks as my father started participating in things with this strange lady that I couldn't possibly express, even in writing. Even after remaining quiet for so long, I hastened to remove the video before I saw any more than I could bear. Then I returned all of my father's belongings to the same location where I discovered them, and I shut the door to that room and never opened it again. I never said anything to either of them, but I grew emotionally detached and began spending as much time as possible away from both of them. I couldn't look at one of them the same way, particularly my father. I hope beyond hope that I did not inherit the illness that it must take to do that to someone you love. Given the timing of things, I'm sure my parents recognized that I uncovered something about their history. They never attempted to make amends. I still can't get the memory of what I saw on that video out of my head. Days stretched into weeks, and the weight of the horrible truth I discovered hung over me. My contact with my parents became more difficult, and the chasm between us got wider. I couldn't get the pictures from that VHS film out of my head. The personal betrayal of my mother by my father, every gaze we shared, was contaminated by the information I now had. My interest switched from the alarming substance of the recordings to the complicated emotions and motives underlying my parents' behavior as time passed. What was the significance of my father's possession of these tapes? Why did he write people's names and recollections on them? And, most crucially, what was Victoria's backstory? I wanted to face my parents and demand an explanation, but I was afraid of upsetting the delicate semblance of our family. Life went on as usual, in the middle of this upheaval, albeit the shadows created by those secrets never dissipated. I began to distance myself even farther from my parents, immersing myself in school, part-time jobs, and spending as much time as possible outside of the home. The basement man cave became a source of fear for me, and I avoided it as much as possible. While my parents were away, I decided to revisit the basement, motivated by a desire to learn the truth. I unlocked the hidden room's door and went through the boxes once again, my hands quivering. The cassette's recollections were like a prohibited puzzle that I felt obliged to solve. I became engrossed in the tales, seeing parts of people's lives emerge. The cassettes weren't only about Victoria. They were a collection of memories shared with other people, including Anthony, Bob, Melissa, and others. It seemed as if my father had been a quiet spectator and possibly even a participant in the lives of others. My resolve to discover the truth got greater. I decided to face my parents. I approached the matter one evening with a knot in my gut. I questioned them about the cassettes, Victoria, and their ties with the persons whose names were written on the boxes. Their sentiments ranged from astonishment to remorse to despair. They'd attempted to shield me from the darkest sides of their history, believing I'd never find out what they'd done. They gradually revealed a labyrinth of complicated emotions, regrets, and blunders. The tales I heard were sad and terrible, putting light on the intricacies of human relationships and the decisions individuals make when they are weak. My mother spoke up about her hardships in her marriage with my father, the difficulties they had, and how they had discussed divorce at times. Victoria had been a buddy who had provided comfort throughout those trying times. My parents used the cassettes to process their emotions, rehash previous errors, and face their emotions. As the reality became clear, my rage and wrath gave way to empathy and understanding. My parents, like everyone else, were imperfect beings struggling with their anxieties, ambitions, and shortcomings. The videos were their way of admitting their sins, attempting to reconcile, and moving on. While the discovery did not remove the suffering, it did provide a perspective that allowed me to begin to recover. Our family embarked on a path of reconciliation that needed open dialogue, forgiveness, and a willingness to examine our history and present. It wasn't easy, and the scars of the past lingered, but the wounds started to heal with time. The recording's recollections lived on, an indelible part of my life's story. In an unexpected turn of events, I found comfort in discussing my challenges and errors with my parents. Our chat served as a link across generations, reminding us that understanding and compassion can arise from the darkest parts of our lives. Years later, my parents' marriage became stronger, based on honesty and the shared experiences of their history. As for me, I kept the lessons I learned from that basement with me, lessons of empathy, forgiveness, and the value of admitting one's flaws. Life has a way of exposing hidden realities, and how we react to those facts ultimately molds our path. As a result, the basement that once housed a prohibited secret became a site of reconciliation, reminding me that darkness can lead to light, and that even the most complicated tales may lead to healing and progress. One night when I was 13, I was home alone for many hours. My parents were leaving on a big day they had planned for a few weeks since it was a Saturday, and my elder sister was hanging around with her friends. I used to like being alone in the home since it meant I could dine on the sofa and watch anything I wanted on TV. I heated some leftover pasta and snuggled down for a relaxing YouTube marathon. The doorbell rang after roughly an hour. It was uncommon for someone to ring the doorbell, much alone late at night. I was understandably shocked, but not terrified. I had no intention of letting anybody in while I was a youngster on my own, but I couldn't help but get up to check who was at the door. So, I moved up softly, making sure no one could hear my footsteps, and peered through the peephole. Nobody was there, which relieved me but also confused me. There were no automobiles parked on the curb in front of the home. I passed it off as some kids, probably younger than me, playing ding doing ditch, and moved away, taking my empty dish of spaghetti from the living room to wash it in the sink. After that, I went to the restroom, sat back down on the sofa, and began watching the movie. I was worried for a while, but I soon relaxed with some blankets and a Coke from the fridge. Unfortunately, someone was back at the door a few minutes later. They weren't simply knocking regularly this time. They were pounding on the door like cops. I leapt out of my skin and peered at the door, seeing how it trembled with each stroke. Maybe it was only because my heart was beating so quickly that I could feel the force of it through the ground and up through the sofa into my chest. Then, as swiftly as it began, it came to a halt. I stopped my movie once again and let the room go silent. I stood up and dragged my feet to the door, shaking like a leaf. Nobody was there when I peeked through the peephole again. This time, though, it did not help to soothe my worries. Getting angry was the only thing that helped me stop feeling afraid. I was compelled to walk outside and curse the kids out of the front yard like a terrible, crazy old guy. Despite the desire, I never opened the door since I knew it would be a bad idea. In a panic, I backed away and snuggled behind all the covers on the sofa, hoping to feel secure again. After approximately 10 minutes, I felt secure enough to restart the TV, but I was still on edge after the entire affair. Later on, I heard what sounded like explosions in the distance and jumped so violently that I smacked my toe on the coffee table. I cursed like a sailor because I knew no one would be offended if I used foul language. During that time, I heard a few additional explosions. A 4th of July had been a month ago. But there were always those folks who continued firing them off at random every day until they ran out. Some of those folks have always lived in my area. I mumbled something about ignorant rednecks and disregarded the noises. But then, only a minute or two later, I felt shivers go down my spine as my agony persisted. Someone began knocking on the front door and rang the doorbell incessantly. Worse still, they were shouting as well. They sounded like a lady, and this time it didn't end after a few seconds as it had previously. They simply kept going, as if they weren't going to stop till they had an answer. I didn't want to move, but my curiosity and aggravation overcame me, and I pushed myself to explore. I crept up to the door as quietly as I could and glanced outside. This time, there was someone at the door, and I knew them. They were my next-door neighbors, the newlyweds who had moved in a few months previously to start a family. She was shouting, terrified, and weeping for assistance. When I got a closer look, I nearly opened the door and invited her in, but I quickly changed my mind. Her face was coated with blood, as if she'd been in a car accident. Something about the blood provoked an acute selfish terror in me that I had never felt before or since. Even though this lady needed assistance, my instinct for self-preservation did not enable me to open the door for her. She'd have to try the next door down if she needed assistance. Since it wouldn't be me, I was not going to take that chance. Even as she screamed, I backed away and crept upstairs to hide in my bedroom. I hid beneath my bed's covers until she eventually gave up, and everything was silent again. A minute later, I heard what I assumed were additional fireworks, so I put on my headphones and turned on some loud music to drown out the noise. But it wasn't long before I was interrupted once again. It wasn't the commotion this time, but the light, the unmistakable flashing of red and blue police lights coming through my window. When I glanced outside, I noticed that the police had surrounded my home and both of my neighbors' houses on either side. Ambulances were also waiting outside to transport the wounded. Unfortunately, as I subsequently discovered, no one was hurt. The officers knocked again, and this time I answered the door. They asked me a lot of questions, but none of them were answered. I didn't find out what exactly occurred until the story broke on the news. Someone mad was playing ding-doo-ditch at people's homes in the area to persuade them to open their doors. His intention at that time was to leap out from behind the corner and shoot them. He moved on to my neighbors when I refused to open up, and sadly, the husband fell for it. When the murderer heard his wife's cries, he threatened her with a revolver to go to the last residence he was at and urged them to open the door. Even while it didn't work on me, it worked on my other neighbors, an older couple. He shot all of them after tricking them with that unfortunate lady, and none of them survived. I barely missed being part of the death toll by following a rule that I used to believe was so simple that it was foolish to state. But evidently, it bears repeating forever. Don't open the door for anybody, particularly when you're alone and especially in the middle of the night. Horrible revelations emerged as the inquiry progressed. For weeks, the madman had methodically planned his sick game, choosing residences where he felt he might catch people off guard. His motivation remained unknown, providing a troubling insight into the mentality of someone capable of such horrible deeds. The episode had a long-lasting effect on the community, breaking the inhabitants' feeling of security and confidence. However, it also served as a terrifying reminder of the significance of being vigilant and cautious, especially in secure situations. That night taught me the fragility of safety and the unpredictability of the human potential for evil. The sound of hammering fists on the door, the urgent calls for aid, and the flashing lights signified a catastrophe that had barely avoided taking my own life. In the aftermath, my neighborhood became a more tightly connected community, with members watching out for one another and more easily exchanging information. Security was beefed up, and the cautionary story became part of local folklore, a warning that danger might strike when you least expect it. The wounds from that night gradually healed over time, but the scars remained. Every creak of a floorboard, every unexpected noise sent shivers down my spine, a recollection of the dread I had felt. But it was also a reminder of my strength, of my ability to follow my instincts and prioritize my safety even in the face of danger. As a result, the lesson learned from that fatal night remained with me, a lesson that would continue to influence my actions, telling me to be attentive, prioritize safety, And never underestimate the potential dangers that may lay behind even the most innocent-appearing moments.